I remember the exact moment I stopped feeling small. It wasn't when I found the texts on the kitchen counter, his phone face up for once, the screen still lit. It wasn't when my own daughter Simone, the girl I had driven to figure skating at 5:30 in the morning for 11 years, walked into the mediator's office and sat down on the wrong side of the table. It wasn't even when she reached into her Burberry tote and placed a printed document in front of me like she was closing a business deal, not dismantling her mother's life. It was the moment right after that, when my solicitor, Hugh Gallagher, a quiet, deliberate man from Halifax who had been practicing family and estate law for 31 years and who I had never once heard raise his voice, set down his pen, looked at the page Simone had just placed on the table, and said very softly, "Oh, just that. One syllable." And I watched my ex-husband Neil's face. I watched the expression on a man I had spent 28 years building something real with. Watched it shift. Just at the edges, from the comfortable certainty he'd worn, since we sat down to something that looked, for the first time in as long as I could remember, like confusion. My name is Evelyn Marsh, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of the day two people walked into a room believing they had already won, and found out, in the most thorough way possible, that they had never understood the game at all. Let me tell you what my life looked like from the outside, because from the outside it looked like very little. Kingston, Ontario. A house on a quiet street in the West End, close enough to Lake Ontario that in winter you could smell the cold coming off the water before the snow arrived. 3-bedroom, a garden I had rebuilt twice over the years because I needed something to tend. A husband who drove a good car and wore good suits, and had the easy confidence of a man who had never had a serious reason to doubt himself. Neil Marsh had grown up in the Annex in Toronto, old professional family money, the kind that comes with a particular set of assumptions built right into the foundation. His father had spent 40 years as a senior partner at a Bay Street law firm. Neil had gone to Upper Canada College, then Queen's, then Osgoode. He had his father's instinct for reading a room, and his mother's absolute conviction that the correct version of events was the one most flattering to the family. He had started his own practice in Kingston in his late 30s. Family law, then estate planning, then a pivot toward commercial real estate transactions. When that market began moving in ways that rewarded people who knew how to read a title search and weren't afraid of a complicated closing. By the time we hit our 20th anniversary, Neil Marsh Law had 4 associates, a paralegal team, and a client list that included some of the most significant property transactions in the Kingston and Ottawa corridor. What the client list did not include, what the office website did not mention, what the annual reviews and the industry's profiles and the firm's own intake documents had never once acknowledged, was the name of the person who had built the operational infrastructure that made all of it possible. That was me. I had come to the marriage with a background in financial administration. Before Simone was born, I had spent 6 years working for a mid-size accounting firm in Toronto, managing client files, reconciling trust accounts, reviewing contracts for anything that didn't line up. I was not a lawyer, I never claimed to be, but I had a particular facility with numbers and a particular intolerance for vagueness in paperwork. And those two things, it turned out, were exactly what a growing legal practice needed and almost never had. When Simone was 3, Neil's firm was still small enough that I could sit at the kitchen table after she went to bed and go through his billing records. I found patterns. I found gaps. I found a trust account reconciliation error that, had it gone undetected another quarter, would have put Neil in front of the Law Society of Ontario. I corrected it. I built a system around the correction so it couldn't happen again. Neil said thank you and we moved on. And the subject was never raised with anyone outside the house. Over the next 2 decades, what I contributed to that practice grew in scope in direct proportion to the practice itself. By the time Neil had 4 associates, I was managing the firm's financial administration, reviewing every commercial file for arithmetic and structural errors before it went to closing, maintaining the CRA compliance calendar, and handling the bookkeeping relationship with the external auditor. All of this was done informally, unpaid in any official sense. I was Neil's wife, not his employee. The work I did was the work a supportive spouse did. That was how it was described when it was described at all. It was never described in front of clients. Simone had always been closer to her father. I understood that. Neil was charming and confident and made things feel easy. And I was the one who asked if the homework was done and checked the bank statements, and made sure the RIASEP contributions went out every month. Children often prefer the parent who is more fun, and I had made peace with that years ago, or thought I had. I found out about them on a Thursday in February. I had gone to the office to drop off the year-end files for the auditor. Neil knew I was coming. He had given me the access code to the side entrance years ago, because I came and went on my own schedule and there was no reason not to. Simone's car was in the lot. I noticed it without thinking much of it, because she had stopped by the office before, occasionally, when she needed to talk to her father about something. I want to be careful about how I describe what I found. What I will say is that there was no ambiguity. There was no explanation I could reach for that would have changed the essential fact of what I was looking at. And what I felt in that moment was not the kind of feeling you see dramatized. It was much quieter than that. It had the particular quality of cold that settles in when something you believe to be solid reveals, very calmly, that it was never solid at all. Neil saw me first. His expression did not go to guilt immediately. It went to irritation, a fraction of a second of pure, unguarded irritation, as though I had walked into a meeting I had not been invited to. Simone stood up. She straightened her jacket with both hands, the way she did when she was composing herself, the gesture so familiar it made my chest hurt in a way I didn't expect. And then she looked at me with an expression I had never seen from her before, steady, decided. Something almost businesslike about it. She said, "Mom, this has been going on for a while. We didn't plan it. But stop. And I think you already knew something wasn't right." I drove home. I sat in the driveway for a long time with the engine running. And then I called the number I had saved in my phone, 3 years earlier, on the quiet recommendation of a woman I had met through a continuing education course on estate law for non-practitioners. She had pulled me aside afterward and said, in a very matter-of-fact way, that any woman doing serious financial work inside of a family business, even informally, should have her own independent legal counsel. Not the family's lawyer. Not a referral from a mutual friend. Her own. I had hired Hugh Gallagher the following month. I had told Neil I was updating my personal will, which was also true. What followed was 11 weeks of very careful work, while Neil retained his own divorce counsel, a litigator from Ottawa named Prentice, who handled high asset separations and had, I was told, an aggressive style that served him well with clients who expected the other party to fold. And while Simone began accompanying her father to what I assumed were planning meetings, Hugh and I were doing something else entirely. We were being precise. The mediation took place in a building in downtown Kingston, 4 blocks from the water, 3rd floor. A room with a long table and good light, and the particular neutral quality of spaces designed for people who are not supposed to enjoy being there. It was a Tuesday in early May. The tulips along the walkway outside were just opening. Neil's counsel, Prentice, arrived with the confidence of a man who had done this many times before, and knew which version of events was going to prevail. He had reviewed the marital asset disclosure Neil's team had prepared, and had built a settlement structure around it. The structure was technically compliant and financially cautious, in the way that offers designed to be accepted by someone who doesn't fully understand their position are always technically compliant and financially cautious. And then Simone walked in. She was not Neil's solicitor. She was not representing anyone in that room in any legal capacity. She was there because she had decided this was her moment, the moment she had chosen and dressed for, and arrived early to secure. She sat beside her father at the far end of the table in a blazer I had given her 2 Christmases ago, and she arranged her hands on the table in the deliberate way of someone who has rehearsed the scene. Hugh placed a blue-tated folder on the table in front of him, and did not open it. The preliminary statements were exchanged. Prentice made his opening, something measured about proportionate division reflecting the primary income earner's contributions to the marital estate. Hugh listened to every word without interruption. And then Simone reached into her bag. I don't know what moved her to do it. Maybe the silence between the statements felt unresolved to her. Maybe she needed to be the one who closed it. She had always needed to be the one who closed things. Even as a child, even at the end of an argument she had already won, she needed the last word. She needed the period at the end of the sentence to be hers. She withdrew her phone, opened something, turned the screen toward me across the table. It was a listing, a rental property. Bachelor apartment, East End of Kingston, listed at $1,400 a month. I found this for you, she said. Her voice was level. Helpful, almost. The performance of helpfulness worn over something much harder. It's close to the bus route, you won't need much space. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Prentice did not move, but something in his posture changed. The small, controlled tension of a professional who had not been informed that this was part of the plan and was now calculating whether it helped or hurt his client's position. Neil's jaw tightened. Not with regret. With the specific tension of a man who had not approved the addition to the script. And then Hugh Gallagher made a sound. Not a laugh exactly. More like the sound a person makes when they have been handed confirmation of something they had suspected, but not been certain of until this moment. A quiet, dry, involuntary exhale of recognition. He picked up the blue folder. He placed it in the center of the table and rotated it until the cover faced Neil's side of the room. I want to note, Hugh said in the same quiet, deliberate tone he used for everything, that the statement just made by Miss Simone Marsh will now form part of the record of this proceeding. That changes the character of this conversation in ways that are, I think, worth exploring. Prentice leaned forward. Hugh, whatever you have in that folder, I'd invite you to open it, Hugh said. What was in that folder had taken 11 weeks to assemble, and it was not complicated. It was just thorough. The first section documented the financial administration work I had performed for Neil Marsh Law over a period of 22 years. Not informally, not as a supportive spouse who happened to look at the files. Formally, documentably, because 3 years into the marriage, on the advice of the same accountant who managed our personal taxes, I had set up a modest administrative services arrangement between myself and the firm. A simple agreement, scope of services, deliverables. A nominal compensation structure that we had never actually paid out but that had been documented, filed, and reviewed at each year-end. The accountant had suggested it for tax structuring purposes. We had both signed it without much ceremony. Neil had, I suspected, forgotten it existed. The agreement covered financial file review, trust account reconciliation support, CRA compliance calendar management, and external auditor liaison. The agreement had been renewed annually. The scope had expanded, documented in addenda each time my work expanded. The most recent addendum, signed 14 months before, Neil told me our marriage was over, covered the full administrative restructuring I had completed to bring the firm's billing and accounts receivable systems into compliance with updated Law Society of Ontario requirements. That restructuring had taken me 8 months. I had completed it without compensation as the agreement specified, but the agreement itself documented it in full. Deliverables, timeline, outcomes, everything. The second section of the folder was evaluation. Not of my personal contributions to the household, of my documented contributions to the firm's commercial value. Hugh had retained an independent business valuator from Toronto, who had reviewed the administrative services agreement, the firm's revenue trajectory, over the 22 years, the specific restructuring work, and the trust account correction from the early years. The one that, had it been reported to the Law Society rather than quietly corrected, would have cost Neil his license and potentially ended the firm before it had properly begun. The valuator had assigned a figure. The figure was not symbolic. My client entered into a formal services arrangement with Neil Marsh Law at the outset of her administrative involvement with the firm. Hugh said, sliding the first pages across the table at the same unhurried pace he used for everything. That arrangement was documented, renewed, and addended over 22 years. The most recent independent valuation of services rendered, adjusted for the risk mitigation value of the trust account correction in year 3, produces a contractual obligation to my client that exists entirely independently of any division of marital assets. He looked at Prentice. The settlement your client has proposed does not acknowledge that obligation. Which means the numbers your client has presented to this table are not the numbers we will be working with today. Prentice asked for a recess. Hugh gave him 25 minutes. During those 25 minutes, Simone did not speak to her father. She sat with her phone face down on the table and looked at the wall past my left shoulder. The rental listing was still visible on her screen, briefly before it went dark. I looked at the tulips through the window. I will not walk through every line of what followed. Some of what was agreed in that room is confidential by mutual choice, and I have no interest in relitigating it. What I will tell you is what mattered. Neil kept the practice's name. He kept the client relationships he had built over 3 decades. The professional reputation, the corner office, with the view of the parking lot he had always been quietly proud of. He kept the things that were his to keep. What changed was everything underneath. The administrative services agreement was honored in full, including the accumulated and unpaid compensation. Across the years it had been documented but never disbursed. The business valuation was incorporated into the asset calculation. The settlement outcome reflected, for the first time in 28 years, the full picture of what had actually been built and who had actually built it. I did not walk away with a bachelor apartment on the east side. Simone called me 6 weeks later. I did not answer. She left a message. I listened to it once, and I have not listened to it again. There are things I may eventually have to find my way toward forgiving, because I am 53 years old and I have no interest in spending the rest of my life in the particular cold of an unresolved wound. But forgiveness, when it comes, will be on my own timeline, and it will not be hurried along by a voicemail. Neil and Simone. I learned through a mutual acquaintance, the wife of one of Neil's former associates, who mentioned it without drama over coffee. We're no longer in contact by the following autumn. I don't know the details. I didn't ask. Some things collapse under the weight of what they were built on, and they collapse quietly, without ceremony, the way most things built on a false foundation eventually do. Hugh Gallagher sent me a card at Christmas, handwritten. 3 lines. He said it had been a privilege to work on a file where the documentation was that clean. I thought about that for a while afterward, the word privilege, coming from a man who had practiced law for 31 years and did not use words carelessly. I live in a different part of Kingston now, West End still, closer to the water than before. A house that is mine in every legal and practical sense. A garden I am rebuilding from scratch, which feels right. A desk in the front room, where the light comes through the east-facing window at exactly the right angle in the mornings. I do independent financial consulting now. Small to mid-size professional practices that need someone who can look at the space between what the books say is happening and what is actually happening. I'm good at it. I have spent 28 years developing a particular skill for finding the thing nobody thought to document, and the thing that was documented but never read carefully. And I find those things quickly now, and I know what to do with them. Here is what I want to leave you with. Simone turned that phone screen toward me because she had already decided what I was. A woman with no leverage, no claim, no real stake in what had been built. A woman who would accept what she was offered because she didn't understand that she was owed something different. She had written the ending of the story before she walked into the room. She needed me to confirm it. What she didn't consider, what people in that position almost never consider, is the work that happened before the room. The years of quiet, documented, unglamorous work that had no photograph and no press release and no moment of recognition attached to it. The agreement signed at a kitchen table and filed away in a drawer. The correction made at midnight that saved something she never knew was at risk. She looked at the surface of a life and thought she understood the whole of it. She was wrong. And the moment Hugh Gallagher made that quiet, involuntary sound of recognition and placed that blue folder in the center of the table, that was the moment the room found out. The people who underestimate you are not always wrong about everything. Sometimes, they're right that you are quiet. Right that you don't take up much space. Right that you never made a point of announcing what you were doing. They are simply wrong about what that means. And eventually, in the right room, with the right documentation, that difference becomes very clear. I want to ask you something before you go, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Has someone who knew you well ever looked straight past everything you had quietly built and decided it wasn't there? Tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone, and if this story stayed with you, you know where to find the next one. Nova Payback. New story every single day.